Hello there and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you find these gentle histories help you drift off, please do like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight we are taking a quiet walk through the life of a man whose mind reached into the furthest corners of time and space, even as his body grew still. Stephen Hawking, a name now familiar to many, was once just a curious child in post-war England, a boy who found patterns in the stars and order in the chaos of numbers. A young man who would, against all odds, live far beyond the years given to him, not in a blaze of drama, but in the soft, persistent glow of thought. This won't be a tale of triumphs and tragedies in the conventional sense. There will be no dramatic crescendos, no breathless revelations, only the slow, steady unfolding of a life lived in thought, through corridors of academia, in quiet libraries, across lecture halls filled with rustling papers and the scent of chalk. You'll hear of long nights under dim study lamps, slow wheelchairs rolling over stone floors, and soft-spoken conversations that shaped the way we think about the universe. We'll explore the texture of his daily life, from the creases in his tweed jackets, to the humming of his speech synthesizer, to the quiet moments spent with students, friends, and family. A man whose voice, though mechanized, spoke to millions with clarity and grace. So if you're ready, nestled in with blankets drawn, let your breath slow as we begin this journey. Drift now into the life and mind of Stephen Hawking. In the gentle winter of 1942, as the world still rumbled with the unrest of war, Stephen William Hawking was born in the quiet university city of Oxford. It was the 8th of January, a date which, by curious coincidence, marked the tricentennial of Galileo Galilei's death. Though it passed unnoticed at the time, this subtle poetic alignment would, in later years, provide a kind of quiet symmetry to the arc of Hawking's life, as though the stars themselves had nodded gently at his arrival. His parents, Frank and Isabel Hawking, were both academically inclined, yet they lived a life that was modest and introspective. Frank was a medical researcher drawn to the intricacies of biology, while Isabel had studied philosophy and politics at Oxford, one of the few women of her generation to do so. Their home, later in St Albans, would be one of books, silence, and gentle eccentricities, where dinner was often eaten in contemplative quiet, each member of the family absorbed in their own reading. Stephen, the eldest of 4 children, grew up surrounded by this atmosphere of thoughtfulness and inquiry. Yet he was not a child who shone immediately in the classroom. His handwriting was untidy, and he spoke with a measured, almost hesitant cadence. Teachers at first did not mark him out for greatness, but those close to him noticed something different, a patience with puzzles, a fascination with how things worked, and a quiet persistence that belied his gentle demeanour. The house was filled with bookshelves bowing under the weight of volumes on mathematics, physics, and history. It was not a noisy house, but it was never dull. There were long walks, subdued dinners, and discussions held with the sort of intensity that might seem out of place elsewhere. Stephen would build elaborate contraptions with his friends, a rudimentary computer assembled from spare parts, or firecrackers lit with calm precision. Even then, there was something methodical about him, a stillness, a slowness, not of mind, but of manner. In school, his marks were not extraordinary, but there was a sense among a few observant teachers that he was capable of something quietly exceptional. He preferred to learn in his own time, to let ideas percolate, and while he was not athletic, he did enjoy rowing, though more as a coxswain than an oarsman. He had, even in his youth, a gift for giving direction, for finding the most efficient path through effort and energy. The family was not wealthy, yet there was never a sense of deprivation. Holidays were spent reading, walking, discussing. The Hawkings were not loud, not showy. They were content with modest comforts and cerebral pursuits. They drove an old London taxicab rather than a new motor car, not out of necessity, but out of a kind of quiet defiance against convention. Stephen's early schooling was at Byron House School in Highgate, where the methods were progressive but perhaps unsuited to his methodical mind. Later, at St Albans School, his abilities began to surface more clearly. He was good at mathematics, though not flashy. He preferred geometry and physics to arithmetic. There was an early fascination with the stars, a curiosity about the vastness above, about the strange order within seeming chaos. Even then, questions of time and existence would stir in him as he lay in bed at night, looking up at the ceiling and imagining it as the sky. There was an air of quiet confidence about him, not arrogance, but assurance. He enjoyed playing board games, inventing complex rules, often outwitting opponents not through guile, but through sheer patience. He liked to debate, not to win, but to understand. He was, in those days, often referred to as Einstein by his classmates, not mockingly, but with a kind of puzzled respect. The routine of life in post-war Britain was subdued. Rationing had only just ended. Streets were still marked by the remnants of conflict. Yet in the Hawking household, the war seemed a distant echo. There, the real battles were of ideas and intellect. Supper was taken quietly, punctuated by musings on medicine, philosophy, or scientific theory. The wireless murmured in the background, and on winter nights the family would huddle in woolen blankets and read by the soft glow of lamplight. Stephen did not yet know what shape his future would take. He did not dream of fame, nor speak of grand ambitions. But he had already begun to think about the nature of things, how they moved, how they changed, and how they might be understood. It was the kind of thinking that doesn't announce itself loudly, but grows slowly, like frost along a window pane, delicate, intricate, and quietly persistent. By the time he applied to university, there was no longer any doubt about his potential. He sat for the scholarship examination to Oxford, and though his results were mixed, perfect in physics, modest elsewhere, his interview revealed a depth of understanding that impressed his tutors. He was accepted into University College, Oxford, the same institution his father had once attended. And so, at the age of 17, he packed a modest suitcase, bid farewell to the quiet home of his childhood, and set off towards the dreaming spires of Oxford. Not knowing, of course, how the course of his life would soon shift in ways both quietly profound and cosmically immense. But for now, the sky above remained steady. The stars were in their place, and Stephen Hawking was just a young man, curious, thoughtful, and on the cusp of something quietly extraordinary. Stephen's earliest years, though not yet shaped by the weighty thoughts of time and space, were coloured by the kind of gentle inquisitiveness that tends to go unnoticed outside the quiet corners of a thoughtful household. In many ways, he was a boy like any other, watchful, slender, often caught gazing at something far away. But there was, always, a quality in his gaze that suggested he was not merely looking, but observing. In the family home in St Albans, the rooms were not grand, but carried the atmosphere of learning. Books spilled from shelves, and conversations drifted softly from one subject to another with the ease of long practice. Stephen, from an early age, learned not just to ask questions, but to sit with them, to let them unfold slowly over time. Where other children might demand answers, he seemed content to explore possibilities. One of his earliest fascinations was with how things worked, not just machines, though he enjoyed tinkering with clocks and radios, but systems of all kinds. He would lie awake at night wondering how the universe could go on forever, or whether it ended, and if so, what came after the end. These were not passing curiosities, but persistent questions, returning night after night, like tides shaping a shoreline. There was a small garden behind the house, not particularly remarkable, yet for Stephen it became a kind of quiet observatory. He would watch the arc of the sun through the seasons, the way the shadows shifted across the fence as the days lengthened and shortened. He once remarked that nature seemed to follow laws, rules that, if you looked closely enough, you might one day understand. These moments were quiet, almost imperceptible to others, but they marked the slow formation of a scientific mind. His curiosity did not always conform to classroom expectations. Teachers often found him inattentive or unremarkable. He was, in truth, somewhat indifferent to schoolwork that did not engage him. Latin, in particular, left him cold. But when the topic turned to physics or to the elegance of mathematics, something would light behind his eyes, a kind of serene interest that stayed with him long after the bell had rung. At home, he would sometimes sit for hours constructing elaborate games with his siblings and friends. These games were not simple, but governed by intricate rules, often invented by Stephen himself. He liked structure, yet he also liked bending that structure just enough to explore what might happen. His imagination, though not theatrical, was expansive and quiet, preferring systems over stories, patterns over plots. The family's evenings were subdued affairs. Frank Hawking would often read in his armchair, spectacles perched low on his nose, while Isabel worked through the day's crossword or wrote notes in the margins of well-thumbed books. Stephen would read too, volumes on science, popular treatises on astronomy, anything that opened a window to the wider universe. It was in this environment, neither pressured nor overly directed, that his mind was allowed to grow in its own peculiar, patient way. At times, he could be absent-minded. He lost things frequently, gloves, notebooks, even his bicycle on one occasion. But this absent-mindedness was not laziness. It was rather a consequence of deep focus. His thoughts were often several layers removed from his immediate surroundings, mulling over abstract problems or visualizing the motion of planets. When his schoolwork began to demand more serious attention, Stephen did not suddenly become a model student. His marks remained uneven, but there were signs that he was beginning to understand things not just as facts to be memorized, but as systems to be deciphered. He had, in particular, an affinity for how physical laws connected, how one principle might echo through another, like ripples on the surface of a pond. Outside the home, he was sociable in a reserved sort of way. He had friends, mostly those who shared his interests in science and engineering. Together, they would build small projects, rudimentary computers, basic rockets, electric circuits wired into wooden boxes. These experiments were not flashy, but they were precise, carefully thought through, sometimes taking weeks to complete. It was not the result that fascinated Stephen so much as the process, the slow unfolding of understanding. There was also a quiet confidence to him, one that did not seek approval, but quietly assumed its own worth. He rarely raised his voice. He never boasted. But he did not shy away from disagreement either. In debates, even as a teenager, he had a calm, deliberate manner, pausing just long enough to make one wonder if he had truly finished his thought before continuing in his slow, clear tone. His parents, though never pushy, encouraged his interests. They took him to museums, to lectures, to second-hand bookshops, where he would lose himself for hours. They spoke to him as an equal, not as a child to be lectured, but as a mind to be engaged. This had a lasting effect. Stephen grew up with the sense that thinking was its own kind of conversation, one that needn't be hurried or loudly expressed, but that could unfold slowly over years. By the time he approached his A-levels, the picture was becoming clearer. His teachers, once unsure, now began to see in him a rare quality. Not brilliance in the traditional sense, but something deeper. A patient kind of insight. A mind that preferred to understand slowly and thoroughly rather than to race ahead. When he applied to Oxford, he chose physics, not because he expected to become a physicist, but because he found in it the most elegant expression of nature's logic. Mathematics, he considered, was beautiful, but perhaps too abstract. Physics offered something tangible, laws that governed the real world, the motion of stars, the arc of a thrown ball, the flow of time. And so, as he prepared to leave for university, Stephen was still very much a boy in transition. Not yet the man he would become, but already shaped by years of quiet thought, gentle encouragement, and a mind that was always asking, quietly, persistently, why? When Stephen Hawking arrived at Oxford in 1959, he was just 17 years old, slightly younger than many of his fellow undergraduates, and with a bearing that, while not exactly shy, was markedly inward. University College, with its ancient stone walls and worn stairwells, became for him not only a place of learning, but a kind of cloister, a quiet, academic refuge where questions could stretch across time, and thought could unfold at its own deliberate pace. At first, the rhythm of life at Oxford seemed almost too relaxed for him. Lectures were infrequent, tutorials only slightly more demanding. The emphasis was on independent study, which suited Stephen's introspective style. But he soon found that he had grown accustomed to minimal effort in school, and the higher standard at university required something different. For the first year, he coasted, as many young students do, spending long hours rowing with the college team, socializing, and doing just enough to keep his tutors from concern. He was not yet the icon of scientific thought that we now recognize. He was, in those early days, a boy with slightly dishevelled hair, often seen cycling through the cobbled streets with his gown flapping gently behind him. He had a fondness for practical jokes, and a wit that was dry and understated. He enjoyed classical music, and had begun to take an interest in the deeper philosophical questions that physics sometimes touches but cannot fully answer. Yet underneath the levity there was a seriousness developing, a quiet, growing sense of purpose. He began to engage more fully with the problems set by his tutors. He took pleasure in solving difficult equations not through brute memorization, but through elegant logic. His mind was sharp, but it was his method of thinking that drew attention, a capacity to see through complexity to the underlying simplicity. His subject was physics, and within physics he found himself increasingly drawn to cosmology, a field that was, at the time, still considered somewhat speculative. It dealt with the largest questions: the origin of the universe, the nature of time, the fate of stars. These were problems not easily reduced to lab experiments or simple models. They required imagination, abstraction, and a comfort with uncertainty, all qualities that Stephen possessed in quiet abundance. There is a story, often repeated, that when he took his final exams at Oxford, He was on the borderline between a first and a second-class degree. He had not always applied himself as diligently as others, though his natural brilliance was evident. During his oral examination, one of the examiners reportedly asked him about his future plans, to which Stephen calmly replied that if they awarded him a first, he would go on to Cambridge for postgraduate study. If not, he might stay at Oxford. In the end, they gave him a first, not perhaps out of indulgence, but because they sensed that he was, in some quiet way, exceptional. Cambridge was his next destination, and there, amid the echoing courtyards and centuries-old traditions, Stephen entered a more focused stage of his intellectual life. He joined the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, where he studied under Dennis Sciama, a gentle and encouraging figure who helped guide Stephen into the emerging world of cosmological theory. It was here that the questions became more precise. How did the universe begin? What was the nature of singularities, those strange, dense points at the heart of black holes and possibly at the beginning of time itself? Was the universe expanding forever, or would it eventually collapse? These questions were not entirely new, but the tools to answer them were just beginning to sharpen. General relativity, developed by Einstein decades earlier, offered a framework, but it was notoriously difficult to apply at the extremes. Stephen, however, had a gift for thinking in pictures, for seeing in his mind's eye the shape of a curved space, the folding of time, the inexorable pull of gravity through the vacuum of space. It was during this time, though, that a quiet shadow began to fall. He had noticed, even before his final exams at Oxford, that he was becoming unusually clumsy. He would sometimes trip or drop things without cause. At first, he thought little of it, but the symptoms persisted, and eventually he agreed to undergo medical tests. The diagnosis, when it came, was both shocking and strangely muted. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a progressive neurodegenerative disease. He was just 21 years old, and the prognosis was grim. Perhaps 2, maybe 3 years to live. His muscles would gradually waste, and his body would fail. But Stephen was not one to yield quickly to despair. He spent a short time in silence, in grief, in reflection, and then, quietly, he resumed his work. If anything, the diagnosis focused him. It narrowed the noise of life and brought his attention fully to bear on what mattered most. His questions, his research, his sense of wonder at the universe. He began attending seminars more regularly. He read voraciously, despite the weakening of his hands. And with support from his supervisor and colleagues, he began to develop new ideas about the singularity at the origin of the cosmos. It was a time of both difficulty and quiet exhilaration. As his body began to slow, his mind seemed to sharpen. He worked not with urgency, but with calm determination. His ideas about black holes and the nature of time were still forming, but already there were signs that he was thinking differently, that he was seeing connections that others had not. In the evenings, he would walk slowly through the quadrangles, leaning more heavily on his stick with each passing week. He was not yet in a wheelchair, but the signs of decline were visible, yet he rarely complained. If asked, he would shrug and smile, and perhaps deflect the question with a dry joke. He had a stubborn sense of humour, never bitter, always understated. Life at Cambridge, in those years, was a mixture of solitude and companionship. He made friends who respected his intellect and admired his courage. He also met Jane Wilde, a student of languages, who would later become his wife. Their relationship was gentle and grounded, built not on drama but on quiet understanding. She gave him a reason to keep going. He gave her a sense of purpose in return. By the time he completed his PhD, Stephen Hawking had already begun to make his mark. His thesis, which dealt with the singularities of space-time, offered new ways of thinking about the birth of the universe. It was not flashy, it did not attract headlines, but it laid the groundwork for much that would follow. He was still young, still facing a terrifying illness, but his mind was alive with questions. And though his steps were slower now, and his voice a little softer, he moved forward with a quiet steadiness that would become the defining rhythm of his life. The diagnosis, when it came, arrived not with a sudden crash, but with the kind of slow, heavy certainty that settles gradually into the corners of one's life. Stephen Hawking was 21 years old, young by any measure, full of potential, full of questions, and yet his body, that most faithful companion of youth, had begun to betray him in quiet ways. He had noticed his fingers slipping from their tasks, his legs misjudging steps, his speech occasionally slurring. These were not dramatic failures, but subtle ones, creeping in like mist over a field, almost unnoticed at first, then difficult to ignore. After a series of tests, long pauses, and quiet consultations in sterile hospital rooms, the words were finally spoken. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, motor neuron disease, as it is more commonly known in the United Kingdom. A progressive condition, no known cure, a slow and steady weakening of voluntary muscles, a life expectancy at that time of 2 or 3 years. The news did not come with fireworks or tears. It came instead with silence. Stephen returned to his room, to the familiar stacks of papers and well-thumbed textbooks, and for a time he simply sat. One can imagine the hush that fell over those hours, the quiet whir of the radiator, the soft ticking of a clock, the muffled footsteps in the corridor outside. He did not speak much about it to others. That was not his way. His approach to life, even before this moment, had always been deliberate, inward, observant. Now, faced with a prognosis that seemed to place an abrupt end on all he had hoped to explore, he did not fall apart. He turned instead to the cosmos. It is perhaps a paradox that even as his physical world began to shrink, his intellectual universe expanded. The diagnosis did not halt his studies. Rather, it lent them a strange kind of urgency, not frantic, but focused. Where once he had been somewhat casual in his habits, he now began to work with a quieter intensity. He chose not to race against time, but to deepen into it, to dwell not on what was vanishing, but on what remained. In the months following his diagnosis, he fell into a period of reflection. His emotions, though largely private, were touched by a kind of gentle melancholy. He later recalled having dreams about being executed, about having only moments left. But even in these darker thoughts, there was a tone of observation rather than despair. He was learning to watch even his suffering with the same clarity he applied to a star's gravitational pull. Support came in gentle forms. His family, stunned but steadfast, provided quiet care. His supervisors at Cambridge continued to offer guidance without pity, and Jane Wilde, a friend he had met before the diagnosis, began to take on a larger role in his life. She was steady, spirited, and unafraid. Where Stephen's outlook could be detached and theoretical, Jane's was rooted in emotion and belief. She encouraged him to hope, to plan for a future, however uncertain. They would sit together, sometimes in the library, sometimes in the garden, not speaking of illness, but of literature, philosophy, music. She helped keep him grounded, not by ignoring his condition, but by seeing the person beyond it. It was not a fairy tale. There were fears, misgivings, difficult conversations, but there was also a growing sense that life, even when shadowed by decline, could still unfold meaningfully. Physically, the changes were slow at first. He began using a cane, then 2. his gait became more labored. Tasks that once took seconds, buttoning a shirt, writing a line of maths, stretched into minutes, then longer. But Stephen adapted. He found ways to conserve energy. He leaned more on mental calculation, trained his memory to hold longer sequences. He learned, gently, to let go of the things he could no longer do, and to focus on those he still could. His work turned increasingly toward the nature of singularities, the points in space and time where the known laws of physics seemed to break down. It was a fitting subject. In these singularities, space collapsed. Time ceased to behave as expected. They were moments of transformation, places where certainty dissolved. And yet, Stephen approached them not with fear, but with calm curiosity. His PhD research gained notice. He began to attend conferences, sometimes with difficulty, sometimes with assistance. He delivered talks slowly, his speech already beginning to soften. But his ideas were clear, and his mind was sharp. His voice, even as it weakened, carried authority, not through volume, but through precision. Those who met him during this period often remarked on his dry wit. He did not indulge in self-pity. Instead, he made light of his condition, not to deny it, but to disarm it. A failed lift, a dropped cup, a stumble, each could become the basis for a gentle joke. He resisted sentimentality. He preferred reason. At home, life with Jane was not without strain. Caring for someone with a progressive illness is not easy, and their marriage would, in later years, face many challenges. But in these early days, there was still a sense of shared purpose. They married in 1965, a small, modest ceremony. Stephen wore a suit with some difficulty, leaning heavily on his attendants. Jane wore a soft smile and carried, if not certainty, then resolve. Together, they set up house. It was not grand. A flat with narrow corridors, steep stairs, and rooms filled with books and medical equipment. Jane took on much of the daily burden, cooking, cleaning, helping Stephen dress. And yet, their life together was filled with the gentle rhythms of young marriage, shared meals, quiet evenings, soft conversations about work and ideas. Stephen continued to write. He published papers, gave lectures, began to develop a reputation. Slowly, carefully, he entered into the broader academic conversation. His illness, while ever present, did not define his work. He insisted on being treated like any other researcher. He resisted offers of special treatment. He wanted only to think, to write, to be taken seriously for his ideas. And his ideas were beginning to shift the conversation. Working with Roger Penrose, he explored the mathematical structures that underpin the universe. Together, they formulated theorems that suggested singularities were not just theoretical oddities, but inevitable features of space-time. This work, quiet and rigorous, would eventually form the foundation of much of modern cosmology. As his body grew more still, his mind roamed more freely. He began to imagine what might happen at the edge of a black hole. Could information escape? What happened to the laws of physics at such extremes? These questions would later lead to his most famous work. But for now, they remained quiet sparks, gently flickering at the edges of his thoughts. In those early years of illness, Stephen Hawking lived not with resignation, but with a kind of steady adjustment. He did not rage against the dying of the light. He simply moved, slowly and carefully, toward it, illuminating in his wake the darkened corners of the cosmos. In the quiet stillness of the 1970s, as his body became more restrained and movement increasingly laboured, Stephen Hawking's mind found itself drifting further into the uncharted expanses of the universe. His academic work, once focused more generally on space-time singularities, now turned more intently toward the enigma of black holes, a subject as opaque and mysterious as the name suggests, yet one that held for Stephen a peculiar and compelling promise. A black hole, in the simplest sense, is a region of space from which nothing, not even light, can escape. Its boundary, known as the event horizon, marks the point beyond which return is impossible. These were not purely theoretical entities, nor were they mere curiosities. They were predictions born from the field equations of general relativity, and Stephen, with his growing precision and quiet persistence, was drawn to them not for their drama, but for their mathematical clarity. He worked slowly, often dictating to students or collaborators, sometimes with the aid of a typewriter operated by Jane or an assistant. His speech had grown more difficult to understand by then, soft, slurred, at times barely audible. Yet those who listened closely could hear the coherence of thought behind each sentence, the careful structuring of argument, the understated wit that remained despite the increasing frailty of his voice. The breakthrough that brought Hawking into the wider academic spotlight came quietly. In the midst of his research into black holes, he considered an apparent contradiction between quantum mechanics and general relativity. Classical theory suggested that nothing could escape from a black hole, that all matter and energy crossing the event horizon would be lost forever. But quantum theory, with its uncertain energies and strange fluctuations, whispered another possibility. In a paper published in 1974, Hawking proposed that black holes were not entirely black after all. Through the subtle, spontaneous interactions of particles near the event horizon, they could, in fact, emit radiation, what came to be known as Hawking radiation. This process was impossibly gentle, almost ghostly, and yet, over immense timescales, it meant that black holes might evaporate, slowly releasing their contents back into the universe. The idea was radical. It united, however briefly, the principles of quantum theory with those of gravity. It challenged previous assumptions. It offered, for the first time, a glimpse into how the deepest laws of nature might one day be reconciled. The initial reaction from the scientific community was one of cautious interest. The mathematics was sound, if surprising. Many resisted the implications. Some dismissed the result. But over time, as the calculations were scrutinized and repeated, it became clear that Hawking's insight was not a fluke. It was a genuine advance, a soft-spoken revolution in the understanding of black holes. For Stephen, the work brought both satisfaction and a quiet kind of fame. He was invited to speak at conferences, often having to dictate his papers in advance, with assistants reading aloud his notes as he sat, still and observant, on the dais. He rarely travelled without help, and each journey required careful planning. Yet he remained undeterred. The limitations of his body, while significant, did not close the world to him. They simply altered the way he moved through it. Outside of the lecture halls, life remained complex. Jane continued to care for him with patience and devotion, though the demands on her time and energy were immense. They now had children, a son, Robert, followed by daughters Lucy and Timothy. The house was filled with the gentle commotion of family life. There were toys and books, children's laughter, the clinking of cups in the kitchen. Amidst it all, Stephen continued to think, to write, to pursue the quiet line of inquiry that had, over time, become the defining rhythm of his life. His fame grew slowly, not with headlines but with citations, not with crowds but with conversations. Physicists across the world began referencing his work. His name became associated with black holes, with the deepest questions of time and entropy. And yet he remained, to those who knew him, much the same: thoughtful, wry, unpretentious. He did not seek attention. He did not enjoy fanfare. He preferred the modest satisfaction of a well-crafted argument, the steady accumulation of understanding. Even as his illness progressed and his mobility diminished to little more than the movement of a few fingers, he adapted. A wheelchair now carried him everywhere. He communicated more and more through intermediaries. But the essence of his work, its careful reasoning, its speculative reach, remained untouched. In the late 1970s, he became a Fellow of the Royal Society, an honour that recognised his contribution to theoretical physics. He also took up the post of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, a position once held by Isaac Newton. It was a ceremonial title in many respects, but it symbolised the respect he had earned, and perhaps more quietly, it marked a kind of symmetry, one brilliant, inward-looking thinker now following in the path of another. Amidst these achievements, Stephen began to reflect more publicly on the nature of time. He considered questions not only of physics, but of meaning. If the universe had a beginning, what came before? If time could one day cease to flow as we know it, what would that mean for human experience? These were not questions of theology, though they sometimes touched the same ground. They were, for Stephen, questions of science, couched always in logic, yet never stripped of wonder. His lectures, though slow and sometimes difficult to follow due to his speech, were well attended. Listeners sat quietly, leaning forward to catch each word, each turn of phrase. There was something compelling, not only in the content, but in the delivery. A sense that here was a man speaking from the edge of both knowledge and ability, drawing on reserves of clarity and determination that most could only begin to imagine. By the end of the decade, Stephen Hawking was no longer merely a respected academic. He was becoming, softly and without fanfare, a figure of broader fascination, a symbol perhaps of the capacity of the mind to persevere even as the body fails. He had written no bestsellers, he had appeared on no television shows, and yet his name had begun to circulate beyond the walls of universities. His fame would grow in time, in ways that neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen. But for now, in the quiet rooms of Cambridge, in the soft scratching of pens, the clatter of typewriters, and the hum of academic conversation, Stephen continued his work. Black holes, time, entropy, the slow evaporation of mass, the nature of beginnings and endings. These were his companions, vast, unknowable, and deeply patient, like him. By the mid-1980s, Stephen Hawking had become a name spoken with quiet reverence in the world of physics. His work on black holes and cosmology had placed him among the leading minds of his generation. Though to the broader public, he remained for the most part a figure at the edge of recognition, respected but largely unknown. It was during this time, amidst the quiet turning of pages and the slow murmur of academic routine, that he began to contemplate something quite unlike his previous work, a book written not for scientists but for ordinary readers. The idea, as he later recounted, was to explain the nature of the universe in a way that anyone could understand. A slim volume, elegant and concise, that would offer readers a path through the complex ideas of cosmology, time, and space without the need for advanced mathematics. It would be a kind of quiet conversation, an invitation to explore gently and without haste the largest questions that physics could pose. He began slowly. Writing, even for those with full use of their hands, is a patient task. For Stephen, who by now had lost nearly all voluntary muscle control, the process was painstaking. He dictated text to assistants, who transcribed his thoughts letter by letter. Later, as his speech became more difficult, he would use a computerized voice synthesizer, operated first by hand and then eventually by a single cheek muscle. Each sentence was carefully selected, each word considered. Progress was not measured in pages, but in paragraphs. The work was both intellectually demanding and physically exhausting, but Stephen approached it with the same calm diligence he had brought to his academic research. He did not rush, he did not complain. He simply pressed on day after day, refining the language, adjusting the explanations, gently guiding his reader toward understanding. He avoided jargon where possible, and when it could not be avoided, he took care to explain it in plain language. Concepts such as the uncertainty principle, curved space-time, and imaginary time were introduced slowly, almost conversationally. The tone was measured, never condescending. He wrote as one might explain something over a quiet cup of tea, with pauses for thought and space for reflection. There were moments of gentle humour too. Stephen had always possessed a wry wit, and it found its way into the text in subtle ways. He spoke of the potential end of time not with alarm, but with the same tone one might use when contemplating the closing hours of a long evening. He noted, with characteristic dryness, that the universe might one day collapse back in on itself, not with a bang, but perhaps with a kind of cosmic sigh. The manuscript passed through many hands before reaching publication. Editors made suggestions. Publishers asked for clarification. Stephen remained patient, focused on his goal, a book that might sit on the shelf of anyone curious enough to wonder why the universe exists at all. He did not aim to dazzle, but to clarify, to make the abstract solid, to turn the infinite into something that could, just possibly, be grasped. In 1988, A Brief History of Time was finally published. No one quite expected what happened next. The book, quiet and thoughtful as it was, became an unlikely bestseller. It appeared in shop windows, was reviewed in newspapers, and began to circulate in households far removed from the corridors of academia. Readers from all walks of life, many of whom had never before encountered physics, found themselves drawn in by Stephen's calm voice, his steady guidance through the stars. The book's success was not instantaneous, but it was steady and enduring. It remained on bestseller lists for years, translated into dozens of languages. It became a kind of cultural touchstone, a symbol of intellectual curiosity, of the human desire to understand one's place in the cosmos. And through it, Stephen Hawking became something more than a physicist. He became a quiet celebrity, a kind of ambassador for the sciences, his voice, metallic and measured, becoming familiar to millions. He did not change with this fame. He remained in Cambridge, continued his lectures and research, still relying on his small team of assistants and the unwavering support of Jane. Life remained challenging. The progression of his illness required frequent adjustments. His speech synthesizer became his only voice. Travel became more difficult. But through it all, he maintained a sense of balance, a kind of internal stillness that grounded him. He gave interviews, slowly and carefully. He appeared on television programs, always with the same understated demeanor. He answered questions with precision, never rushed, often with a small smile playing on his lips. When asked about his condition, he did not seek pity. When asked about the universe, he did not pretend to know all the answers. He continued to write, to think, to explore. His fame never seemed to interfere with his purpose. He was not drawn to the spotlight for its own sake. Rather, he saw in it an opportunity. to share ideas, to encourage others to think, to make the vastness of the cosmos just a little more approachable. The royalties from the book brought financial stability, allowing for better care and equipment, for modifications to his home, and for travel that had once seemed impossible. Yet he lived modestly, much as he always had. A cluttered study, a battered wheelchair, a quiet cup of tea. The essentials remained unchanged. Perhaps the greatest achievement of A Brief History of Time was not its sales or its accolades, but its effect on those who read it. It inspired not awe, but curiosity. It did not answer every question, but it opened the door to asking them. In this way, it reflected Stephen himself, not grand or dramatic, but deeply, quietly engaged with the mystery of existence. And so, through slow, careful work, typed out word by word, selected through muscle and thought, Stephen Hawking offered the world a gentle map of the universe, a guide not to certainty but to wonder, a brief history, perhaps, but one that would echo through the minds of readers for years to come. By the close of the 1980s, Stephen Hawking had become a familiar figure to many, recognizable not only for his groundbreaking work in physics, but also for the machine-generated voice that carried his thoughts into the world. It was a voice flat in tone, American in accent, and somewhat robotic in rhythm. And yet, over time, it became inseparable from Stephen himself. For many, it was as though the mechanical cadence had absorbed something of his dry wit, his patient intelligence, and his unmistakable character. The use of the voice synthesizer began after a serious bout of pneumonia in 1985. He had been on a trip to Geneva when the illness struck, and it very nearly took his life. A tracheotomy was required to save him, a procedure that removed his ability to speak altogether. For a time, he communicated by raising his eyebrows to signal letters and words, a method slow and exhausting. But in the months that followed, a new system was developed, a computer-based communication aid known as the equalizer, originally designed by a California programmer named Walt Woltosz. It was mounted on his wheelchair and connected to a speech synthesizer. At first, Stephen selected words by hand, using a clicker held in his fingers. Later, as his muscle control diminished, the device was operated using a single cheek muscle, one twitch at a time, one letter at a time. Conversations, once effortless, became slow exchanges of patience and intent. But Stephen adapted, as he always had. He was never one to dwell on what was lost. Instead, he turned his attention to what remained possible. The new voice was not expressive in the traditional sense. It could not convey tone or nuance easily. But Stephen used it with great effect. He mastered its rhythms, its cadences, its silences. He would pause for emphasis, let the gaps between words carry weight. His humour, dry and well-timed, was enhanced, in some strange way, by the calm neutrality of the machine. A joke delivered in a flat electronic voice often gained more charm than it might have had otherwise. He did not wish to change the voice. Over the years, newer and more natural-sounding synthesizers became available. But Stephen remained loyal to the original. It had become part of his identity. He once remarked, with characteristic understatement, that he had grown rather fond of it. People recognized him by it, and in a way, it allowed him to speak in a manner entirely his own. With the synthesizer, he continued his work unabated. Lectures were prepared in advance and read aloud by the device. Interviews were conducted slowly, with long pauses between questions and answers. Every sentence was composed deliberately, every word chosen with care. It was not spontaneous, but it was deeply thoughtful. He came to embody, in many ways, a new form of communication, one that required patience, clarity, and mutual respect. The machine became more than a tool. it became a channel. Through it, Stephen lectured in packed halls, responded to press inquiries, recorded voiceovers for documentaries, and eventually appeared on television and in film. Audiences listened not with distraction, but with attentiveness. The effort required to speak, visible in the slight movement of his cheek, the flicker of concentration in his eyes, seemed to bring a kind of reverence to his words. At home, the device served everyday needs as well. He used it to speak with his children, to joke with carers, to give instructions. The house was filled with its familiar intonations, the mechanical voice drifting through doorways, announcing preferences, commenting dryly on the state of the weather or the latest scientific paper. It was never silent, this machine. It hummed and clicked and responded with the same measured voice, always calm, always clear. The technology surrounding Stephen continued to evolve. His wheelchair became more sophisticated. Computers were updated, cables rerouted, batteries recharged. A small team of engineers, assistants, and students worked behind the scenes, ensuring that each component functioned correctly. It was a quiet symphony of cooperation, technicians solving problems, carers adjusting equipment, all to keep one mind connected to the world. And through it all, Stephen remained remarkably consistent. He did not lose his temper when the device failed. He did not become frustrated when the system lagged. He waited, he adapted, he smiled often. Those around him would later say that it was his patience, more than his intellect, that left the deepest impression. As his public profile increased, the voice came to represent something more than just Stephen's thoughts. It became a symbol of resilience, of adaptation, of the quiet determination to remain present in a world not built for such limitations. Schools invited him to speak. Children wrote to him, asking how the machine worked. Disabled individuals saw in him not a figure of pity, but of possibility. He recorded messages for space missions, offered greetings to international audiences, even made guest appearances on popular television shows. Each time, the same voice emerged, measured, slightly formal, unmistakable. It spoke of stars and time and the nature of reality, but it also spoke, silently, of endurance. There was no ceremony in the day-to-day use of the machine. It was part of the furniture, part of the rhythm of Stephen's life. It needed charging, updating, cleaning. Assistants would troubleshoot it in hotel rooms and airport lounges, in university halls and on film sets. And always, Stephen would wait, calm and unhurried, his eyes resting softly on the screen, ready to begin again. The voice did not carry emotion in the traditional sense, but over time it came to convey something far deeper. It spoke not with inflection, but with purpose, and behind it always was Stephen, watchful, amused, quietly tenacious. In the end, it was not the sound of the voice that mattered, but the steadiness with which it was used, one word at a time, one sentence formed through will and intention, a voice not born of vocal cords, but of thought and machine, of patience and practice. And for those who listened, there was a lesson in that sound, that presence does not require volume, and that even the faintest voice, when used with clarity, can echo far into the night. Though Stephen Hawking's public profile grew steadily from the late 1980s onward, the quiet routines of daily life remained at the centre of his existence. Behind the public appearances, the television interviews, and the academic conferences was a domestic world, layered with care, responsibility, and the often unseen labour of living with profound disability. It was a life shaped as much by the slow rhythm of household chores and the gentle clatter of cutlery as by the silent mechanics of the cosmos. Home for Stephen was a place of both comfort and complexity. The house was modest in size, but adapted carefully over time to accommodate his evolving needs. Ramps were added, doorways widened, rooms rearranged. Every corner bore evidence of his presence, shelves sagging slightly under the weight of books, a computer station by the window, a wheelchair charging in a corner, humming faintly. It was not an austere place, nor overly formal. It carried the feeling of an academic's home, functional, lived in, quietly filled with thought. Jane, his first wife, continued to care for him with deep dedication. Their marriage, while forged in love and commitment, was inevitably tested by the challenges of their life together. The demands were constant. Stephen needed assistance with nearly every physical task. Dressing, eating, washing, moving from one room to another. Jane took on these responsibilities with determination, even as she pursued her own academic studies and raised their 3 children. The household was busy, at times noisy, with laughter and conversation, but also periods of tension and exhaustion. The children, Robert, Lucy, and Timothy, grew up surrounded by their father's machines, by the quiet buzz of synthesized speech, and by a mixture of ordinary parenting and extraordinary circumstance. To them, Stephen was simply Dad. They remembered not the equations or the accolades, but the little things, rides on his lap as he sped through the house in his wheelchair, bedtime stories read with the help of his voice synthesizer, games played through gestures and expressions rather than words. Stephen loved being a father. He engaged with his children in ways that may not have appeared conventional, but were deeply attentive. He would discuss their schoolwork, explain difficult concepts in ways that respected their intelligence, and take pleasure in their achievements, large and small. He had an impish sense of humour, and often found gentle ways to tease or surprise them, reminders that life, however physically constrained, could still be playful. Work and home were not strictly separated. His study, often the quietest room in the house, was filled with papers, notes, and drafts of articles. Students came and went, sometimes working with him at the kitchen table, sometimes wheeling beside him as he moved from room to room. Assistants, too, became part of the family rhythm. Some stayed for years, others for shorter periods. They read to him, typed his dictations, adjusted his equipment, and travelled with him when he lectured abroad. His work was carried out with quiet consistency. Mornings began slowly, often after a long process of washing and dressing. Breakfasts were simple. The day unfolded in blocks: dictation, meetings, correspondence, research. Emails became a primary method of communication, allowing him to work at his own pace, crafting replies with the same care he applied to his writing. Students submitted papers, colleagues sought input, publishers requested revisions. He answered them all, carefully, patiently. Meals were taken with family when possible. The process of eating, often assisted, was unhurried. Conversations meandered. The family might discuss current events, a child's school day, or a passage from a novel. Stephen enjoyed hearing about the world beyond academia. He was curious about politics, culture, music. His favourite foods remained simple pleasures. He loved curry, though it was not always easy to eat. Friends often remembered how he managed a quiet delight in a well-spiced dish, even if it required a little extra effort. Evenings brought a kind of stillness. The household would quieten after the bustle of the day. Stephen might watch a program on television or listen to music, classical most often, though he enjoyed some modern pieces too. Visitors were frequent: friends, colleagues, former students. They would sit in the living room, sipping tea or wine, the synthesized voice punctuating the conversation with steady precision. Travel was part of life, too. Conferences in far-flung cities required careful planning. Air travel with a wheelchair and medical equipment was never easy. Assistants accompanied him everywhere, managing logistics with quiet efficiency. Hotels were chosen for accessibility, lecture halls for their acoustics. The days were often long, but Stephen thrived on the interaction. He enjoyed meeting other scientists, exchanging ideas, listening to new theories. Even when exhausted, he would remain alert, observant, and full of questions. There were tensions, naturally. Over time, the strain on Jane became too great. The weight of caring for someone so physically dependent while raising a family and maintaining her own sense of identity took its toll. The marriage, though lasting many years, began to fracture quietly. They separated with a mixture of sadness and mutual understanding. Stephen later remarried. His second wife, Elaine, had been one of his nurses. That chapter of his life brought new challenges and new companionship, though it too would eventually come to a close. Throughout all these personal changes, Stephen's work continued. He co-authored papers, revised books, gave interviews. He took part in scientific debates, always with calm persistence. He published additional popular works, expanding on themes from a brief history of time. Each project was an act of endurance as much as intellect. Each idea shaped slowly, one character at a time. His colleagues respected his discipline. They noted how he never used his condition as an excuse, never requested indulgence. Deadlines were met, appointments kept. His contributions, always rigorous, were valued for their originality and their clarity. He became a mentor to many, a quiet presence in the department whose insights carried weight far beyond the walls of the university. And so, life unfolded year by year. There was no great upheaval, no dramatic turn, just the slow, steady rhythm of home and work, of family meals and journal articles, of birthdays and equations, of changing seasons and unchanging resolve. A life lived within constraints, but never defined by them. For most people, the thought of international travel is accompanied by a mix of anticipation and mild anxiety. Flights to catch, luggage to pack, passports to remember. For Stephen Hawking, travel was an undertaking of a very different order. Every trip required extensive preparation, careful arrangements for transport, accommodation, medical assistance, equipment, and always the understanding that even the smallest oversight might bring considerable discomfort or difficulty. And yet, despite all this, he travelled often and far. Not because he sought adventure or out of restlessness, but because his work and his growing status in the public imagination gently drew him to the far corners of the world. From the 1980s onward, invitations arrived regularly. Lectures, symposiums, honorary degrees, interviews, and scientific gatherings. Institutions in Europe, the United States, Asia, and Australia all wanted to hear him speak. Often these trips were centered around major events, a keynote lecture, a panel discussion, the launch of a book, but they frequently included quiet visits to local institutions, private meetings with scientists, or moments of cultural exchange. Each journey began at home, sometimes weeks in advance. His assistants, now a small and dedicated team, managed every detail. Wheelchair access, vehicle hire, flight seating arrangements, local medical facilities, dietary needs. The computer equipment alone required care, adapters for different voltages, backup systems, spare parts. It was, in effect, the planning of a small expedition, and yet the mood was rarely fraught. Stephen himself remained calm, allowing others to worry on his behalf, but always taking an interest in the destination, in what he might learn, and in the audiences he would meet. On the aircraft, he travelled seated in his chair, specially secured. The noise and movement never seemed to trouble him much. He passed the time in thought or listening to music, sometimes reviewing a lecture script prepared in advance. Cabin crew and passengers alike often recognized him, not with fuss, but with quiet acknowledgement. It was, after all, difficult not to recognize him. The distinctive chair, the softly flickering computer screen, the electronic voice that spoke with such precision. Upon arrival, his time was carefully divided. There would be a few hours to rest, to adjust to a new time zone. Then meetings with local scientists, students, journalists. His lectures, delivered via the synthesizer, were usually prepared beforehand, but he liked to leave space for interaction, questions from the audience, moments of humor, gentle tangents. The response was almost always warm, sometimes reverent. Attendees listened with rare attentiveness, leaning forward to catch the measured flow of words, the pauses, the dry jokes nestled within explanations of quantum mechanics and relativity. He did not rush from event to event. His days were paced carefully, allowing for rest and the slowness imposed by his condition. But in every city there was a sense of occasion. He might visit a local observatory, a museum, a cathedral. He enjoyed seeing the architecture of ancient universities, the hush of old libraries, the symmetry of great halls, and always he brought with him not the air of celebrity, but of curiosity, a quiet desire to know what others were thinking, to see what work was being done. His presence could alter the tone of a gathering. Where academic conferences often veer toward formality or competition, Stephen's presence introduced something gentler. People spoke more carefully, listened more closely. He became, in his own quiet way, a kind of anchor, someone whose very presence reminded others of the value of patience, of resilience, of thought pursued over decades rather than days. Not all travel was academic. There were cultural visits too. He was fascinated by art, music, and history. In Italy, he visited the Leaning Tower of Pisa, noting with quiet amusement its precarious defiance of gravity. In Japan, he admired the serenity of traditional gardens, the ordered beauty of ancient temples. In the United States, he spoke at NASA, met astronauts, and marveled at the scale of engineering used to reach beyond Earth's bounds. And yet, even in such moments, he remained grounded. He did not let spectacle distract from substance. He was at heart a theorist. His interest in space was not in the rockets, but in the laws they followed. His interest in time was not in clocks, but in the conditions that made time itself possible. Travelling by wheelchair in a world not fully designed for accessibility brought its challenges. Not every building was suitable. Not every lift worked. There were moments of awkwardness, ramps too steep, doorways too narrow, bathrooms without the necessary fittings. But Stephen took these things in stride. He rarely complained. He trusted those around him to solve the problems, and they did so with quiet dedication. He came to see travel not as a burden, but as a continuation of his life's work, a way of sharing ideas, of encouraging dialogue, of reaching those who might not otherwise engage with physics. And in return, he received extraordinary warmth. Children wrote letters. Students queued for hours just to ask a question. Scientists expressed their gratitude, not just for his theories, but for his presence in the field. The trips took their toll, of course. He would return home exhausted, requiring days to recover. The physical demands were real, the risks never negligible. But for Stephen, the exchange was worth it. The world had opened itself to him, and he had opened himself to the world, not loudly, but steadily, through the slow movement of his chair across marble floors and ancient courtyards, through the soft hum of his voice amid thousands of listeners. In a sense, he travelled not just across geography, but across lives. He became, without effort, a part of other people's stories. The student who first heard of black holes in a crowded auditorium. The professor who shifted her research after a quiet conversation in a lift. The child who saw in him a reminder that disability is not the end of thought, but perhaps its deeper beginning. And so, across time zones and borders, between airports and institutions, Stephen Hawking moved through the world. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate, thoughtful pace that had always defined him. His wheels turned slowly, but his reach extended far beyond them. The academic life is often imagined as a flurry of lectures, heated debates, and rapid discoveries. Yet, for Stephen Hawking, the rhythm was slower, more meditative, shaped by limitation, yes, but also by a profound respect for thought pursued in depth, not haste. His days were not hurried. His questions were not answered in flashes of inspiration. They were turned over, quietly, sometimes over years, like stones in the hand, warmed slowly by patient attention. At the heart of this life was Cambridge, a place where history clings to every stone and where scholars, generation after generation, come to pose questions that rarely have immediate answers. Stephen became not just a fixture of the university, but a kind of quiet guardian of its intellectual traditions. His office, often dimly lit and filled with books and equipment, became a place of encounter. Students, colleagues, assistants, all passed through its door, often unsure what to expect and nearly always changed by the experience. He was not an ordinary lecturer. By necessity, his style differed. Spoken lectures were typed in advance and delivered through his synthesized voice. This mechanical tone, far from alienating, lent his talks a curious solemnity, each sentence landing with deliberate clarity. He could not write equations on the blackboard, nor gesture toward diagrams, and yet his explanations carried weight. They were distilled, precise, and sometimes quietly profound. Students respected him not just for his fame or intellect, but for the seriousness with which he treated their ideas. He did not flatter, nor did he dismiss. He listened carefully, reading typed messages, watching expressions, and then offered replies that were at once economical and illuminating. His supervision sessions might be brief, sometimes no more than 20 minutes, but they were rarely wasted. A single question from Stephen, softly uttered through the machine, could shape weeks of work. He had, over the decades, mentored dozens of doctoral students. Each came with their own ambitions and uncertainties, and each was in some way touched by his example. Not all worked on black holes or cosmology. Some came from other disciplines, mathematics, theoretical physics, even philosophy. What united them was not subject matter, but an openness to difficult questions and a willingness to think slowly. Late at night, Stephen often worked alone. The quiet suited him. Assistants might go home, but he would remain in his chair, the glow of the computer screen illuminating his face, the click of the cursor, the soft whir of machinery, the occasional sigh from a kettle cooling on the counter. These were the sounds of his thinking. He would read papers, draft responses, compose passages for future books. His working hours were unorthodox, stretching well into the early hours, but they allowed him the stillness he needed, uninterrupted and unhurried. Some evenings were spent in quiet discussion. A colleague might drop by with a new idea. A visitor from another university might stay late after dinner to talk theory. The conversations were never hurried. Stephen would listen intently, occasionally interjecting with a wry comment or a probing question. He was not easily impressed by enthusiasm alone. He looked for clarity, for rigor, for ideas that had been thought through with the same patience he applied to his own. When he gave public lectures, they were often packed to the rafters. People sat on steps, stood at the back, lined up hours in advance. Many did not understand every word. Some came simply to witness him, to see the man whose mind had travelled to the edges of time. And he never disappointed. His slides were clear. His explanations, though demanding, were never inaccessible. And his jokes, sprinkled sparingly through the talk, landed with a kind of unexpected warmth, the humour made more charming by its unembellished delivery. He spoke not down to his audience, but across to them. Whether addressing a group of school children or a hall of physicists, he struck the same tone, respectful, thoughtful, quietly inviting. He never shouted, never sought applause. And yet, applause always came, sustained, grateful, sometimes even tearful. Stephen's lectures were not performances. They were conversations, structured carefully around the belief that knowledge is not a gift to be bestowed, but a path to be walked together. He took questions afterward when time and energy allowed. He answered slowly, sometimes choosing not to answer at all if the question lacked seriousness or clarity. But when he did reply, it was always worth the wait. Within the university, he was a presence both awe-inspiring and familiar. Porters greeted him with nods. Fellow professors chatted with him over tea. He was not aloof. He attended faculty meetings, reviewed applications, and sat on committees when he could. His status never separated him from the mundane duties of academic life. And perhaps it was this ordinariness, this quiet willingness to remain among his peers, that made his extraordinary qualities shine all the more brightly. His assistants, many of them young researchers or graduates, became both colleagues and companions. They managed his emails, scheduled his talks, prepared his slides, but they also joked with him, talked about books and music, shared stories about their own lives. He listened, he asked questions, he remembered small details, and when they moved on, as most eventually did, he remained in touch when possible, always interested in where they had gone and what they were doing. Stephen's intellectual world never shrank, even as his physical world did. He corresponded with scientists across the globe, debated theoretical points via email, followed developments in particle physics, quantum theory and cosmology with undiminished curiosity. New discoveries were not greeted with resistance but with welcome. He was never afraid to revise his views, to acknowledge error, to change direction if the data required it. And all the while his thinking continued. Slowly, methodically, he would lie awake at night turning over an idea, visualizing equations, picturing curved space-time, wondering whether a new approach might yield something useful. He rarely rushed to publish. Each paper was the result of months, sometimes years, of careful deliberation. His co-authors learned to wait and to trust the process. Even in the face of declining strength, his mind remained clear. His ideas, formed now in silence and patience, travelled through the hands of others, through the hum of machines, onto pages that would influence generations. And so, within the walls of Cambridge and in the wider halls of science, Stephen Hawking lived a life of gentle instruction and persistent thought. His lectures were slow, his replies measured, his pace deliberate. But in every pause, in every moment of stillness, there was movement, the quiet motion of a mind never at rest. As the 1990s unfolded and the 21st century crept into view, Stephen Hawking found himself in an unexpected position, not only as one of the most recognizable scientists of his time, but as something rarer still, a figure of cultural affection. He had, without effort or ambition, entered the broader imagination, not through spectacle or self-promotion, but by simply remaining himself, steadfast, thoughtful, patient, and quietly, unmistakably present. this was not a role he had sought. His work remained deeply technical, his schedule filled with academic duties, his thoughts occupied by black holes and quantum gravity. Yet, gradually, and then more visibly, he became a figure known not only in lecture halls but in living rooms, on television screens, in cartoons, in comedy sketches, in animated parodies voiced by machines attempting to imitate his own. He did not resist this gentle fame, nor did he court it. Rather, he observed it with the same curious detachment he might have brought to a new mathematical model. He understood, perhaps more deeply than most, that the image people carried of him was not the full man, nor even the full scientist, but a projection of something they hoped to believe in: resilience, intellect, perseverance in the face of profound adversity. Appearances in popular culture began to accumulate. He made a memorable cameo on Star Trek, The Next Generation, playing poker with Einstein and Newton in a quietly amusing scene. He appeared more than once on The Simpsons, his synthesized voice offering witty asides and surreal scientific interventions. Futurama, The Big Bang Theory, and other shows followed suit. In each, he was portrayed with a mixture of reverence and lightness, a rare balance that few public figures manage to inspire. Stephen found these appearances amusing. He understood the cultural language of parody, and he seemed to enjoy the strange alchemy of seeing his theories and his likeness transformed into jokes and cartoons. He never took himself too seriously, and perhaps that was the key. He allowed himself to become a part of the culture, but never allowed it to dictate his path. There were documentaries too, some narrated in his own voice, others featuring reenactments, interviews and commentary. He lent his name and his mind to projects that sought to explain science in ways that were accessible without being superficial. He worked with filmmakers, animators and educators. The line between science and storytelling became, in these efforts, more fluid, and Stephen, though always grounded in the discipline of physics, recognized the value in helping others to care. He gave public talks that were, by now, major events, attended not only by students and scholars, but by families, school children, artists, and journalists. His books continued to sell widely, including follow-up volumes such as The Universe in a Nutshell and Brief Answers to the Big Questions. These were not mass-market entertainments, nor were they academic treatises. They occupied a quiet middle ground, intellectually serious but warmly written. They spoke not down, but across. His popularity brought its own challenges. The more recognizable he became, the more demands were placed upon his time. Interviews, invitations, honorary degrees, public appearances. The world wanted to see him, to hear from him, to be reassured, perhaps, that such a mind could still flourish in so fragile a vessel. His assistants fielded countless requests, filtering them with quiet efficiency, always mindful of his energy, his health, his need for space. And yet, amidst it all, he remained remarkably steady. He did not retreat, nor did he lose himself in the attention. He continued to live modestly. The routines of his day were unchanged: waking, washing, working, resting. He answered emails with care. He advised students. He followed new papers in physics, reading them line by line, dictating comments, sometimes challenging assumptions, always with clarity and calm. He appeared in advertisements too, lending his voice to public service announcements or campaigns that encouraged science education. These were carefully chosen, never frivolous. He once featured in a spot urging people to save energy, his machine voice asking viewers to imagine a world without stars. Another time, he participated in a music video, his synthesizer weaving through a composition in a way that was unexpectedly poignant. There was, in these appearances, no hint of vanity. He did not seek the limelight. He simply acknowledged that his presence could be useful, that a familiar voice, even a digital one, could open minds. And so, when approached with sincerity and purpose, he often agreed, not out of ego, but from a quiet sense of duty. Some critics wondered whether the popular image of Hawking, brilliant but fragile, heroic yet abstract, overshadowed his actual scientific contributions, but those who knew his work knew better. His papers continued to shape discussions in theoretical physics. His collaborations were ongoing. His questions had not ceased. Fame had not diluted the precision of his thought. For those who met him in person, the experience was often unexpectedly quiet. He did not dominate a room. He listened. He observed. He answered questions slowly, one cheek twitch at a time, one word after another. He asked questions in return. He smiled wryly at small absurdities. He had no need to perform. His presence was enough. And through it all he maintained a kind of inwardness, a centre of stillness that fame could not touch. He knew, as few do, the importance of silence, not just as a limitation, but as a space in which thought could gather, deepen, find its shape. He knew that popularity, like gravity, could distort if not carefully managed, and he managed it, always, with grace. As he entered his later years, the cultural tributes became more frequent. Awards were given, biographies were written, films were made. The most well-known of these, The Theory of Everything, portrayed his early life and marriage with sensitivity and care. He praised the performance, noting with quiet amusement that Eddie Redmayne, who played him, had better hair. But even as he was portrayed on screen, he remained a presence in real life, travelling, speaking, writing, present not as an icon, but as a man, still thinking, still questioning. In a world that so often demands immediacy, Stephen Hawking offered something different, a slow voice, a quiet manner, a long view, and in that slowness, in that patience, he became not just a scientist, but a symbol of how thought, even when slowed to a crawl, can reach the furthest edges of the known universe. In the stillness of night, long after the lights of the lecture hall had dimmed and the crowds had gone, Stephen Hawking often turned his thoughts to the most difficult and perhaps most human of questions. Beyond black holes and entropy, beyond quantum fluctuations and the shape of time, lay a subject that resisted equations. The question of God, of beginnings, purpose, meaning, was not one that Stephen approached with ceremony or sentiment, but with the same quiet curiosity he brought to all things. He was not a man of faith in the conventional sense. Raised in a household where religious belief was present but not prominent, he had always preferred the company of empirical questions. The scientific method offered a clarity, a rigour that religious language did not, and yet he never dismissed the question entirely. Instead, he reshaped it, asked it on different terms. Not, perhaps, does God exist, but is God necessary? Not, what does God intend, but can the laws of physics explain all that we see? Over the years, he addressed these matters with calm precision. In public talks and interviews, he was often asked about his beliefs. Did he believe in a creator? Did he believe in an afterlife? Each time he replied without irritation. He explained that science, in his view, offered increasingly complete accounts of the universe's workings, leaving less and less need for supernatural explanations. Not out of hostility to religion, but from a desire to understand the universe as a closed system, governed by laws, not interventions. In A Brief History of Time, he famously ended with the observation that, should a complete theory of the universe be found, it might allow humanity to know the mind of God. Some readers took this as a nod toward faith, a poetic invocation of the divine, but Stephen later clarified that it was metaphorical. His use of God referred to the totality of physical law, not a conscious being. He was not mocking belief, nor preaching against it. He was simply redefining terms, gently, in the language of physics. He admired aspects of religious tradition, its moral reflections, its history, its place in human culture, but he could not himself embrace belief in a personal deity. His universe was one of mathematics and symmetry, of paradoxes and predictions, and within that framework he found a kind of beauty that was, in its own way, spiritual, the elegance of an equation, the subtlety of quantum fields, the notion that time itself might have no beginning, no edge from which to fall. He spoke, too, of the Big Bang, not as a mystical event, but as a state described by physics. With colleagues, he developed models of a universe without a beginning, a smooth, finite entity, like the surface of the Earth, without boundaries or singular starting points. In such a model, the notion of a moment of creation loses its traditional meaning. There is no before, no initial cause. The laws simply are. This view, while unsettling to some, was not presented with triumph. Stephen did not relish the discomfort his ideas caused. He simply followed the reasoning where it led. His role, as he saw it, was not to close questions, but to reframe them. If the universe can be explained through known laws, then it may not need a designer. If it began as a quantum fluctuation, then its origin lies not in will, but in possibility. And yet, he recognized the emotional pull of belief. He understood that many found comfort in the idea of a purposeful creation. He did not ridicule this. He simply asked whether comfort should be the measure of truth. He preferred discomfort if it brought clarity, uncertainty if it brought honesty. He did not pretend to have the final answers, but he knew how to ask the right questions. In later works, such as The Grand Design, he returned to these themes. There, he argued that the laws of physics, once understood, could fully account for the origin of the universe. That gravity, quantum theory, and the principle of M-theory were sufficient, that no creator was required. The reaction was predictably mixed. Some embraced his reasoning, others accused him of overreach. But Stephen did not react defensively. He simply continued, quietly, to explain. He remained on good terms with religious thinkers. He engaged in debates with philosophers, theologians, scientists of different views. He listened carefully. He responded slowly and always with respect. He did not seek confrontation. He sought coherence. There was a stillness in his stance, an absence of dogma. He did not claim certainty about all things. He acknowledged the mystery at the heart of existence, but he believed that mystery, when approached patiently, could yield to understanding, that the universe, vast and cold as it may seem, need not be terrifying, that knowledge, slowly gathered, could be a form of light, and perhaps that was, in its own quiet way, a kind of faith, not in a deity, but in the mind's capacity to know, not in miracles, but in reason, a trust that the universe, no matter how strange, was open to those who asked gently and listened long. Stephen Hawking did not need God to make sense of the stars, but he did not scoff at those who did. He simply looked up, as he had always done, and asked, with the calm of one who has known silence, what the stars themselves might be saying. As the years wore on, Stephen Hawking's place in the world of science shifted subtly. He was no longer the young firebrand proposing bold new ideas about singularities and black holes. He had become an institution unto himself, respected, revered, and gently questioned by younger scientists who had grown up reading his papers. And yet, he remained an active thinker, still asking, still reaching, still proposing new ideas that invited both admiration and quiet disagreement. The landscape of theoretical physics was itself changing. New instruments, such as the Large Hadron Collider, offered data that grounded theory in observation. String theory, once at the margins, had become a dominant language among physicists seeking a unified framework. Quantum gravity, loop theory, multiverses, these were the terms of debate now. And Stephen, though no longer at the very centre of the latest formalism, remained engaged. He followed the developments, offered commentary, and occasionally waded in with a fresh perspective. One of his most enduring fascinations remained the black hole information paradox. Decades earlier, he had proposed that black holes could evaporate via Hawking radiation, a notion that upended traditional assumptions. But this led to a troubling implication. If the radiation carried no information about what had fallen into the black hole, then that information would be lost forever, violating one of the central tenets of quantum mechanics. This paradox became a defining puzzle of modern physics. Stephen's stance on the matter evolved over time. Initially, he argued that information truly was lost, a radical position. Later, he revised this view, suggesting that perhaps the information was preserved after all, encoded subtly in the radiation. The shift was not a capitulation, but a refinement, reflecting his openness to correction and his deep respect for the coherence of quantum theory. The debate continued in seminars and conferences, among chalkboards and preprints, but Stephen's voice remained central, sometimes challenged, never ignored. In 2004, at a conference in Dublin, he publicly announced that he had changed his mind about the information paradox. It was a moment that made headlines, though delivered in his typical understated fashion. The exact mechanism by which information might escape a black hole remained unclear, but he now believed it did. The room filled with applause, not for agreement necessarily, but for the humility of the gesture, the willingness to update one's position in the light of new reasoning. Later, Stephen explored more speculative ideas. He wrote about the multiverse, the notion that our universe might be just one of many, each with different physical laws. He entertained hypotheses that questioned the very nature of reality, including the possibility that time itself might be an illusion at the deepest levels. These were not mainstream positions, and some physicists pushed back. They argued that such ideas, while intriguing, lacked testability, that they drifted too close to philosophy. Stephen did not mind. He believed that science had room for speculation, provided it was disciplined. He understood that frontiers were not tidy, that progress sometimes required daring as well as rigor. He once remarked, with characteristic restraint, that he had made a living out of being controversial. But his controversies were never inflammatory. They were quiet provocations, gentle ripples sent across the surface of well-established theories. He continued to publish papers, often in collaboration with former students. His writing remained precise, if necessarily slow. Assistants typed his thoughts as he composed them letter by letter, word by word. Each paragraph took time. Each diagram required effort, but he remained committed. Even as his body grew increasingly fragile, his mind wandered freely through 10 dimensions and cosmic brains. There were other controversies too, less scientific, more public. His comments on artificial intelligence, for example, drew widespread attention. He warned, in stark terms, of the dangers posed by machines that might one day surpass human intelligence. Some critics dismissed the warning as alarmist. Others took it as a sober reflection from a man whose life had been intimately shaped by machines. His voice, after all, was already mediated by artificial intelligence. He did not fear technology. He feared its misuse, and he said so, quietly, repeatedly, in interviews and essays. He also spoke about human survival, of the need to look beyond Earth, to consider colonizing other planets, to develop technologies that might preserve our species against existential threats. These views, too, were met with skepticism by some, but Stephen did not present them as prophecies. They were considerations, posed in the spirit of thoughtful inquiry. He believed in human potential, but he was not blind to our limitations. Through it all, he retained his dry humor. He joked about aliens, about time travelers, about the absurdities of fame. He once held a party for time travelers, inviting them only after the date had passed. No one came. "Proof," he said, with a faint smile, "that time travel is not possible." These gestures were playful, but not frivolous. They reminded his audiences that science, even when serious, need not be solemn. Among colleagues, he remained a figure of deep respect. He did not dominate conversations. He listened carefully. He disagreed politely. He encouraged young researchers, asked difficult questions, and accepted disagreement with grace. His presence at conferences was met not with deference, but with genuine warmth. People came to see him, not for spectacle, but for thought. He was aware of his legacy, but did not seem overly concerned with shaping it. He continued to work, to think, to share. In public talks, he still spoke of black holes and time, but he also spoke of life, of the importance of curiosity, of persistence, of humor. He urged audiences to look up at the stars, not down at their feet, to make sense of what they could, to live as fully as possible. His later theories may not have carried the revolutionary impact of his earlier work, but they reflected a scientist still engaged, still asking, still exploring. They were the thoughts of a man who had lived long in the presence of mystery and had come to find, in that mystery, not fear, but quiet companionship. And in that, as in so much of his life, Stephen Hawking remained a model, not of perfection, but of persistence, not of certainty, but of thoughtful uncertainty, a scientist to the end and beyond it. Time. It had been Stephen Hawking's lifelong companion, subject of his studies, fabric of his theories, and ever-present shadow in his daily life. He had spent decades unraveling its secrets, tracing its origins, measuring its curvature, questioning its beginning and end. But in his later years, time became something more personal. No longer just a coordinate on a graph or a variable in an equation, it was now the gentle measure of his own life. A life that, against all expectations, had unfolded far longer than the doctors had once foretold. He had been given just a few short years when diagnosed in his early 20s, and yet the years stretched out, quietly, patiently, into decades, not without struggle, not without cost, but filled with work, with thinking, with love and thought and adaptation. The passage of time for Stephen was both miracle and mystery. He spoke often of its complexity in the universe, but rarely of what it meant to him personally. When he did, it was with the same calm understatement that coloured so much of his life. He once said that however difficult life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. He meant this not as encouragement in the usual sense, but as a simple observation, one that had guided his own path. His illness had slowed his movements, altered his speech, reshaped his routines, but it had not stopped the motion of his mind, nor the quiet unfolding of his ideas. He had lived within constraint, and yet had experienced something very close to intellectual freedom. In interviews and later writings, he he began to reflect more openly on mortality. He did not approach the subject with gloom. There was no romanticism, no longing. Rather, a kind of mathematical acceptance. He knew that the body failed, that time marched on, that entropy increased. But he also knew that knowledge accumulated, that ideas persisted, and that the universe remained, vast and waiting. He did not believe in an afterlife, at least not in the traditional sense. When asked, he would reply that the brain was like a computer, and that when it broke down, its functions ceased. There was no heaven, no continuation. But this did not depress him. It made life more meaningful, more urgent. "We have this one life," he wrote, "to appreciate the grand design of the universe, and for that I am extremely grateful." Gratitude. It was not a word often associated with Stephen, yet it lingered quietly behind many of his statements. Gratitude for the time he had been given, for the people who had cared for him, for the ideas that had filled his days and occupied his nights. He was not sentimental, but there was always a quiet appreciation, expressed not in effusive words, but in the steadfast way he lived. His reflections on time were not confined to death. He also thought deeply about time's beginning, its nature, its direction. He wrote about the arrow of time, the one-way flow from past to future, marked by increasing disorder. He found beauty in the asymmetry, the way time allows memory, but not foresight, the way it holds us in a particular direction, even as the laws of physics themselves are often indifferent to such flow. He considered whether the universe might be finite or infinite, whether time had a clear beginning or might, in some models, fold in on itself. He spoke of imaginary time, a mathematical construct that allows for a universe without boundaries. These were not idle speculations, but part of his larger effort to create a coherent model of the cosmos. Yet one sensed, especially in later years, that his interest in these questions was also personal. Time was not just an object of study, it was a terrain he inhabited. He celebrated his 60th, 70th, and eventually 75th birthdays with quiet events, lectures, gatherings, reflections. Each milestone carried a mixture of surprise and composure. He had outlived so many predictions, and each year became a kind of quiet rebuttal to assumptions. He marked these occasions not with fanfare, but with renewed thought, new essays, new talks, new ideas. He remained at work almost until the end, publishing, advising, corresponding. He did not speak of retirement. His life was not structured around the notion of withdrawal. He had learned long ago to find a pace that suited him, a slow, deliberate rhythm that allowed for rest, but also for continuation. He rose when ready. He worked when able. He rested without guilt. In his final years, his public visibility remained strong. He continued to speak on science, on humanity's future, on technology. His warnings about artificial intelligence grew more pointed, his hopes for interstellar travel more vivid. But he also spoke, increasingly, about the need for kindness, for wonder, for shared purpose. He became, in a quiet way, a voice not just for science, but for a kind of secular humanism, a belief in our shared curiosity, our shared fragility, our shared time. And when the end finally came, it did so gently. On 14th March 2018, coincidentally the birthday of Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking passed away in his sleep, in his home in Cambridge. The news spread quietly but swiftly. Scientists, students, friends, strangers, all paused to remember him, not just for what he had done, but for how he had lived, with humour, with discipline, with persistence. Tributes came from every corner of the world. Heads of state, physicists, authors, artists. His synthesized voice was played on radio stations. Images of black holes were shared online. Quotes circulated, some accurate, others apocryphal, but all pointing toward a man who had become, in his own still and patient way, a symbol of thought in the face of difficulty. He was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey near Newton and Darwin, not for grandeur but for continuity, a thinker among thinkers, a questioner among questioners, a man who had spent his life exploring the edges of time, and who now, in the quiet of death, returned to it. His legacy remains, not only in the equations that bear his name, or the books that still sit on bedside tables, but in the quiet reassurance that thought, pursued slowly and sincerely, can reach across years, across stars, across the unknown. The morning of 14th March 2018 unfolded like any other, clouded skies over Cambridge, the slow rustling of leaves against old windows, footsteps echoing on stone, and yet, within hours, the world would come to understand that something subtle yet profoundly significant had changed. Stephen Hawking was gone. The voice that had echoed from lecture halls and across airwaves, that quiet, mechanical tone now so familiar, had fallen silent. The news came not as a shock. His condition had been delicate for years, but as a stilling, a sudden hush across the global conversation. In the hours that followed, tributes began to appear, slowly at first, then in a gentle flood. Physicists, journalists, world leaders, former students, parents, children, all spoke of him, not with bombast, but with warmth. There was a softness in the collective remembering, as if the world had not lost a celebrity, but a kind companion, a thinker, a presence. He had passed away peacefully, surrounded by family in his home, the same place where so many of his thoughts had emerged, slowly, patiently, over decades. There was no final speech, no dramatic farewell, just the closing of a life lived in persistent defiance of limitation, a life that, though defined by stillness, had moved so many. News outlets around the world marked the day with reflections on his work, his life, his legacy. Some focused on a brief history of time, others on his scientific contributions. Some remembered his appearances in comedy shows and cartoons, while others recounted personal meetings, quiet moments shared in university corridors or after lectures. Almost all, though, returned to one simple truth. Stephen had made people feel that the universe, though vast and mysterious, was something we were allowed to wonder about. In Cambridge, candles were lit. In schools and observatories across the world, moments of silence were held. His words, typed, spoken, quoted, were read aloud in classrooms, whispered at dinner tables, posted on social media alongside photos and equations. People shared favourite passages, like his reflection that, "Look up at the stars, not down at your feet," or his reminder that it would not be much of a universe if it wasn't home to the people you love. There was something unusually personal in the morning. For many, Stephen had been a quiet presence in their intellectual lives, a kind of distant mentor. His very existence, a mind unbound by its physical constraints, had stood as a testament to resilience. People who had never studied physics, who might never grasp the details of event horizons or imaginary time, still felt connected to him. He had, in a way that few scientists ever do, crossed the boundary between the academic and the human. At Westminster Abbey, where he would later be laid to rest between Newton and Darwin, preparations began for a ceremony that would be both formal and gentle. His ashes would be interred not simply because of fame, but because of contribution, because he had thought carefully about the universe and had helped others to do the same, because he had asked with quiet sincerity questions that touched not just the stars, but the soul. The ceremony, held that June, was marked by reflection rather than grandeur. Students, colleagues, and family gathered. Readings were given. A passage from a brief history of time was broadcast into space, directed toward the nearest known black hole, just over 3,000 light-years away, a quiet gesture, poetic perhaps, but fitting, his words travelling outward slowly across time. His memorial stone was simple, just his name, his dates, and an equation, his most famous one describing the temperature of a black hole. It is an equation that unites the principles of quantum theory, general relativity, and thermodynamics, a compact expression of a universe's paradoxes, a signature left not in ink, but in thought. In the weeks that followed, his absence was quietly felt. Colleagues missed his emails, students passed by his office and paused. The chair, the computer screen, the softly blinking cursor, now still. The department at Cambridge continued, of course, as all institutions do. Papers were written, lectures delivered, but the atmosphere had changed just slightly, as though a constant star had slipped below the horizon. Yet his work remained, his ideas, his papers, his books, not sealed, not finalized, but still part of the conversation. The paradoxes he wrestled with still tug at physicists today. The questions he posed about time, about information, about the beginning and end of things have not been resolved, nor are they likely to be quickly, but they are clearer because of him. And beyond the work, there was the man, Stephen, with his dry humour, his stubborn patience, his unhurried manner, the way he leaned into difficulty without fanfare, the way he asked others to explain themselves clearly, calmly, the way he smiled, not broadly, but with the corner of the mouth, the twinkle of the eye. In the years since his passing, his memory has remained quietly alive. Films and biographies continue to explore his life. His voice is still played in classrooms. His equations are still printed in textbooks. But more than that, his presence lingers in the quiet encouragement he offered, without ever intending to be inspirational, to think carefully, to persist gently, to be curious always. Stephen Hawking did not believe in destiny. He did not think the universe owed us meaning, but he believed with quiet resolve that we could find meaning nonetheless, that through understanding, through persistence, through the act of asking, we could make sense of our place in the cosmos. And so, on that quiet March morning, the universe lost a star. Not a flare of light, but a constant presence, a point of thought, steady and enduring. The kind of star that does not blaze across the sky, but anchors the night. Stephen Hawking's work continues, his voice still echoes, and in the hush between our questions, in the long pause after wonder, we can still feel what he gave us, the courage to think, slowly and sincerely, about the whole of time.